And today, the Supreme Court has answered that question by a vote of 6-3.
The U.S. Supreme Court has just issued a major ruling.
Major Second Amendment case.
Major Supreme Court ruling.
The Supreme Court has just issued a high-stakes order in a critical Second Amendment Preservation Act challenge that's been pending in front of them for months. We need to look closely at what is happening right now in this case, because it represents a major turning point for state-level gun protections. But before we jump into the details of this legal battle, I want to take a second to wish every one of you a very Merry Christmas. I truly hope you had an amazing time with your family and friends. I also want to say thank you for the incredible support you've shown for this channel. And for the topics we break down here, if you want to keep supporting what we do, the best way to do that is simply to hit the subscribe button. It's the engine that keeps this channel running. Now, as I mentioned, we're talking about a very significant Second Amendment protection case that was seeking emergency review from the Supreme Court. This case centers on Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act, better known as the SAPA law. We've discussed this specific case before because, in the past, the Supreme Court issued a surprising 8-1 order that denied Missouri's request for protection, which effectively kept their law blocked. Well, the case recently went back in front of the High Court, and we finally have an answer. In a brand new order, the Supreme Court has once again denied emergency review for the Missouri SAPA case. But here's the thing. This case is far from over, and that's largely due to some very specific promises made by the Trump DOJ in their recent filings. You might remember that throughout this legal battle, the federal government has argued that the SAPA law is invalid. Interestingly, the Trump administration has continued some of that momentum, arguing that the law is unconstitutional in certain applications and that the Supreme Court shouldn't bother reviewing it yet. However, they made a massive concession. The Trump DOJ told the Supreme Court that if they denied the review and sent the case back down to the lower courts, the administration would voluntarily move to lift the total blanket injunction that the Biden administration had originally secured. Essentially, they promised the justices that once the case was back in the hands of the district court, they would stop blocking the entire law and only focus on specific parts. Missouri's legal team responded to this immediately. They pointed out to the Supreme Court that these very concessions from the Trump DOJ are exactly why the court should have granted a full review. They argued that if the federal government is admitting the prior injunction went too far, then the case clearly needs a higher level of scrutiny. Missouri also raised a very serious concern that many of us are thinking. What happens if the Trump DOJ doesn't stay true to their word? What if, once the Supreme Court denies the case and the spotlight fades, those promises to lift the injunction simply disappear? Unfortunately, the Supreme Court chose to take the administration at its word and denied the review. This has left the door wide open for the DOJ to follow through, but so far, we haven't seen them make a single move to actually remove that complete block on the law. To understand why this matters, we have to remember what this 2021 law actually does. The Missouri SAPA law was designed to set a clear state interpretation of the Second Amendment. It places strict limits on the support and funding that Missouri would provide to federal agencies if those agencies try to enforce gun laws that the state views as unconstitutional. It basically tells state and local officers, you are prohibited from helping federal agents enforce laws that trample on the rights of our citizens. But the real teeth of the law come from the civil remedy it created. It allows any resident of Missouri to sue a state official or agent if that official helps the feds enforce a law that violates the Second Amendment. The whole goal was to shift the power of enforcement directly into the hands of the people, rather than leaving it to the discretion of government officials. When this went to the district court, the Biden administration won a total victory. The judge struck down the entire SAPA law, claiming it violated the Supremacy Clause. Missouri didn't back down. They appealed to the Eighth Circuit and asked for a temporary stay so the law could remain in effect during the appeal. The Eighth Circuit refused, which led to Missouri's first trip to the Supreme Court. That resulted in that lopsided 8-1 vote, where only Justice Thomas was willing to step in. After that, the case went back to the Eighth Circuit, which held a quick hearing and ruled in favor of the federal government once again. Missouri's latest petition for Supreme Court review focused on a very troubling aspect of that Eighth Circuit ruling. The lower court basically admitted that the structure of Missouri's law is legally valid under the Anti-Commandeering doctrine, which says the feds can't force states to help them. But then, the court struck it down anyway because they didn't like the underlying purpose of the law. They essentially ruled that because Missouri was trying to protect the Second Amendment specifically, the law was somehow improper. They even went so far as to say that when a state official does nothing, as in they refuse to help the feds, that non-action is still a form of enforcement that the federal government can block. Missouri argued this was a total reversal of clear Supreme Court precedent. Now that the Trump DOJ is in control, the strategy has shifted. For months, they stalled their response to the Supreme Court, but when they finally answered, it was a mixed bag. On one hand, they still maintain that the SAPA law is invalid. But on the other hand, they admitted in writing to the justices that the previous judgment might have extended too far. They acknowledged that portions of the Act constitute mere non-enforcement of federal law, which is perfectly legal under our constitutional system. They stated that because of these concerns, the United States has decided to acquiesce in narrowing the scope of the judgment once the district court regains jurisdiction. So, the Trump DOJ got exactly what they asked for. The Supreme Court denied the emergency review. But here's the problem. The case has now officially been remanded. The notice of denial has been sent to the 8th Circuit and the Missouri District Court. And yet, the total injunction is still standing. The total block that the Biden DOJ secured is still in place today. The Supreme Court effectively handed the keys back to the Trump administration. And now we're waiting to see if they will fulfill their promise to the court. Will they actually move to release the parts of the SAPA law that they admitted are constitutional? Or was that just a legal maneuver to keep the Supreme Court from getting involved? This is a huge concern for gun rights advocates in Missouri and across the country. If the DOJ doesn't follow through, it means the state's attempt to protect its citizens from federal overreach remains completely dead in the water. We are in a wait-and-see mode right now. The mandate has been issued, the lower courts have been notified, and the ball is entirely in the DOJ's court. If they don't move to lift that injunction soon, Missouri may have to go back to the drawing board to force the issue. Despite the Supreme Court's refusal to step in right now, there is still a sliver of hope. The fact that the federal government admitted on the record that parts of the law are constitutional is a massive win for future litigation. It's no longer a question of if the law has valid parts, but when those parts will be allowed to take effect. We're going to keep a very close eye on this, because if the Trump DOJ fails to fulfill its promise to the Supreme Court, it will be a major blow to the trust of the Second Amendment community. So, that is the current state of this critical battle over state sovereignty and gun rights. It's a complex situation with a lot of moving parts, but I'll be right here to update you as soon as the next filing hits the desk. If you found this breakdown helpful, please do the usual, like, comment, and make sure you're subscribed. All of those interactions help us fight the algorithm and get this information out to more people. You can also click on one of the videos you see here on the screen to keep learning more about these critical topics. As always, thank you so much for your support. Never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and it will be maintained by armed scholars. I'll see you in the next one.